Well, the day I thought would never come has finally arrived. Here we are, the day that it's here. The great Brexit border checks are now online. Of course, how fully online? We will find out in just a bit. Because, oh my, we have been talking about the problems that the second you start not only like the physical checks, but you start to implement paperwork on these goods coming from the UK from the EU into the UK, this is going to rocket up prices. You are looking at least on some products a rise of, or at least now companies having to pay, depending of course how much and consignment size, etc. The average is around £145. Now that may not sound a lot, but imagine this: you are doing and you are receiving multiple loads. That £145 would soon start to add up. And it would add up to a lot, especially as we've talked about before for small businesses. We've talked about the problems that UK delis are now going to face with their problems trying to get meats and cheeses in from Europe. Garden centres also now facing these problems. Farmers also now seeing huge problems about livestock sales and transfers that could affect them as well. All kinds of stuff. The classic pizza, if you remember that example of, well, yeah, you have a pizza, but then what goes on that pizza as well? So this is all going to end up in a colossal disaster. We are going to see queues. We are going to get huge probable examples of smuggling because remember, there's still no legal requirement as far as I am aware, unless that has changed. But as far as I am still aware, there is still no legal requirement for a lorry once it is driven off the its ferry from Europe and hits UK soil, still no legal requirement to go to the checking center. Yeah, that's not going to totally end up, backfiring now, is it? Anyway, before we get into today's story, I want to go over the other story that I was going to go because this highlights just how bad this is. So this is an industry chief commenting on this, and this goes to show you just how bad things are. But trust me, it's about to get even worse. So the government has now single-handedly created the world's most inefficient and expensive border. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and it has now been squandered. And we now await the government-enforced consequences for both businesses and consumers. The UK government has ignored our extensive advice on how to streamline the border processes, and instead, they have now created a strategy that is both incompetent and hugely expensive. This will drive up the costs for all sectors, which will ultimately now be passed on to the consumers who are already struggling with the costs of living. We have become the laughingstock of Europe. Bear in mind, that's just one industry body expert who's been talking about this since this whole kicked off. Yeah, laughingstock of Europe. Wait until you see what happens next because yeah, um, yeah, things could be about to go from bad to incredibly worse as these checks officially sort of kick in today. And of course, once they kick in, the consequences will be felt very, very quickly. So before we do go getting into that, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page, the one off Dacia link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee, the YouTube thank you button, and of course, as always, you can just click the like and the share button. And thank you very much to all the people who do help and support the channel. So let's have a look at what happens here. So this comes from Politico. The title of Brexit Border Chiefs Left in the Dark Hours Before New Checks Kick In. Yes, people in charge of these borders had no idea about these checks hours before they were meant to be set in. Let's find out more, shall we? So, Britain is now meant to be launching the quote most advanced border in the world this week, but it doesn't feel like that to the people actually running it. With the implementations now of the second and the most critical part of the phase of the UK's 5 times delayed Brexit border regime commencing on Tuesday, ports are now still being left in the dark on the critical details by the British government. These physical checks on UK animal and plant products into the island nation are now meant to begin on the 30th of April. So that is today. But at specifically designated border control posts. So it's all part of the government's border targeting operating model. Needed, now it's left the bloc single market. But, but with just hours to go, commercial port owners, many of whom have now pumped millions of pounds of their own cash into setting up these high-spec inspection facilities, have serious concerns about how they are meant to recoup the costs of running them. An exasperated senior port executive, granted anonymity to speak freely, said, "It's enormously frustrating that after literally years, a period where the physical checks at ports have been ready and at a time where ports are feeling the wrath of customers for charges they are not of the ports doing, we are still waiting on the government to deliver 1 minute to midnight." Under this new border system, selected importers will now have to submit animal and plant products posing a quote medium risk to UK biosecurity to identify these physical checks at the border control points. The checks test for pests and diseases and involve temperature readings as well as visual inspections. Importers will then be invoiced for these checks by the commercial ports. But even at this stage, ports are still processing offer urgent access to a post-Brexit government IT system that is crucial for ensuring that they can actually invoice importers. So, yeah, these checks are going to go great. Just remember, laughing stock of Europe. So, a letter sent last week to the UK's Cabinet Office by Richard Ballantyne, the Chief Executive of the British Ports Association, and Rachel Hetcher, the Chief Executive of the UK Chamber for Shipping, warned that it is not possible to know how many eligible goods are going to be transported through ports, as well as to who to invoice this blank charge. Without this information on the government's import and animal products and food and feed system, what they need is now access to the IT system. They say, in a way, to order to have a realistic opportunity to recover costs from users and importers. In a meeting with the operators last week at the Britain's Environmental Department, DEFRA, they tried to calm fears, where they said that they are trying to work on sharing some data with ports, but they have now conceded of the technical fix for doing this might not be available for months. So remember, they're starting today, but the data some of the ports need is not going to be available for months. Perfectly working country. Anyway, it will still need all the data sharing agreements between the port operators and DEFRA, and the government now may end up charging ports for access to this data. So, yeah, information that they need to run and to operate a system that the government has put on them, they now need to pay for access to that data. Gee, prices sure aren't going to increase, aren't they? Anyway, the main issue for ports is that they are now what are affected is that they now need to recover their ongoing operational costs, and secondly, their contribution to the capital costs, explained Mark Salmons, the Director of Policy and External Affairs for the British Ports Association. He said that they are now eager to start doing so because even now they are incurring costs of keeping these border posts going, even though they are not being used. So, without the effective means of charging port operators, the choice of either not charging importers at all or finding some temporary fix for their own. One workaround currently being explored would involve billing intermediaries, such as the shipping companies, who would then in turn bill their customers, a move that inevitably piles on an extra layer of bureaucracy. And now, obviously, we get back to the quote that we just went through. So, despite having years to plan for this new border regime, the British government now appears to have left many of the critical details until the last minute. Shock horror. A government that our current government leaving things to the last minute. Perish the thought. Anyway, repeated delays to the border regime now mean that control posts have been left standing empty because empty, causing them to be branded Brexit white elephants by port staff. Earlier this month, ministers finally published the details of the new charging regime for the checks of its own state-run border control post at Sevington, the village in Kent. These blanket fees for importers, known as a common user charge, will range from £10 for low-risk goods for goods up to £145 for mixed consignments. And that is going to add so much extra cost to so many small businesses. And they've got to pass it on to the consumer. Like you've got no choice but to either A, eat it, or you pass it on to the consumer. That means prices on a ton of different products are going to rise. But Nigel Jenny, the chief executive of the Fresh Produce Consortium and trade body, described these costs as now exorbitant and warned that they will add millions of pounds of annual costs to the supply chain. The UK government has now ignored our exhaustive advice on how to streamline these border processes. Instead, they've created a strategy that is both incompetent and hugely expensive. They will now drive up the cost for our sector, which will ultimately be passed on to consumers already struggling with the cost of living. We have become a laughingstock of Europe, he argued. A government spokesperson said, these border checks are now fundamental to protecting the UK's food supply chain and farmers and the natural environment against costly diseases from reaching our shores. They've estimated that it's only going to be a 0.2% increase on food prices over the next 3 years. Businesses will save around, according to them, £520 million a year compared to the model originally proposed, the spokesperson said. But as far as I'm aware, this has been this has been what was the model proposed all along. What was this other model they were talking about? Is that Jacob Rees-Mogg's cyberpunk border he was approaching? And then of course they're talking about how all this, it's going to be all light touch. Don't worry about it, guys. Yeah, it's just going to be, a light touch. We'll phase this in incrementally. Meaning that these costs, these checks are just going to roll on and roll on and roll on, potentially making a bad system even worse. We've only been warning about this since what, 2016? So yeah, happy border day, guys. I'm sure this is totally not going to feature in any more videos in the coming weeks and or months, right? Right? Oh, it will. And then, of course, roll on the more complex stuff this is going to cause at the port. The fact that this is going to jam up even more traffic potential this summer, as we've seen every single summer. Expect there to be stories about people missing their Easter holidays because of, the queues at Dover. Um, yep, we'll see what happens, but trust me, expect a lot of stories about this. Anyway, so as always, let me know what you think down below because honestly, this is an absolute mess. But as always, thank you very much for watching. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.